good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. I'm Maria Volpe. Welcome to our 268th gathering of the monthly roundtable. I started these after 9/11 to provide everyone with an opportunity to come together to talk about, at that time, the relevance of conflict resolvers in the shadow of what had just happened at the World Trade Center. And out of that early gathering, we created what is now a monthly gathering for all of us. And here we are, just about ready to, I don't want to say celebrate, recognize 25 years since 9/11 that we have been meeting on this first Thursday of the month. Every month, these roundtables are made possible by a wonderful committee of colleagues, including Nikki Borofsky, Matthew Latimer, Sherston Pugh, Chloe Choi, Elizabeth Grossman, and Alex Yaroslavsky. These morning events are recorded and posted on YouTube, the John Jay Dispute Resolution Center website, and the ACR GMY website. These breakfasts, as I said, are co-sponsored by both the CUNY Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College and the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York. I want to take just a minute this morning to share that we aim to hold these gatherings on the first Thursday of each month, whenever we can. And we have to plan them months in advance. We do our absolute best to try to keep major holidays in mind when we're scheduling these events. And today is one of those really important days for a number of religions. It's the first day of Passover, and it's Holy Thursday for some Christians. For those who aren't able to join us this morning, as I said, these sessions are recorded and they are posted. So hopefully those who can't be here due to religious observances are able to hear Najeeba's amazing presentation. We're very fortunate to have Najeeba Syeed with us this morning. I've known Najeeba since 1998 at least. That feels like the last century, Najeeba. She has had a long and distinguished career shining the spotlight on interfaith dialogue. And I'm thrilled that you're here with us this morning. And so sorry that it's so early for you in California. It is, 5 a.m. there, 5:30. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Nikki, who will introduce you more formally. Take it away, Nikki.
Thank you, Maria. I'm just going to introduce our speaker a little more formally, hope to kind of set the scene for what I hope will be a really wonderful presentation and discussion to follow. So welcome again to everybody. This community of global practitioners, scholars, and bridge builders joining from many places, traditions, lived realities, including very early mornings and earthquakes, especially for our speaker. At this time of the year, many of us are marking sacred moments. As Maria mentioned, Passover, Holy Thursday, pretty recent celebration of Eid, the turning of Nowruz. I know my recent past has been filled with Seder plates, shared meals, dyed eggs, tying herbs in knots, and gathering to reflect, renew, and share. So wherever you are and whatever you may be holding personally, professionally, or spiritually, we're very glad that you're here and you've made the time to join us. And I really think that it's important to say this plainly. This is not an easy moment. Across many parts of the world, conflict is not theoretical. It is lived, it is close, and for many, it's ongoing. Many of us are carrying loss, fear, uncertainty, and in some cases, grief. So the question of today's session, interfaith solidarity in times of hate, is not abstract. It's very immediate. In times like these, solidarity is no longer just a slogan. It's a decision to reach across difference where it would be easier not to stay in relationship where it becomes uncomfortable, and to act when it matters. So it is my pleasure in this context to introduce Professor Najeeba Syeed. Najeeba is the inaugural El-Hibri Endowed Chair and Executive Director of the Interfaith Institute and a tenured full professor of religion at Augsburg University. She is also a senior fellow at the Oxford Interfaith Forum. She has served as a visiting professor at Yale and Mercer Universities and is a very sought-after advisor to programs across the country, as represented by her jetting from Stanford to Chicago and being able to join us today. Her scholarship and practice focus on interreligious engagement, and she is widely recognized for her work in Muslim-Jewish relations, as well as sustained engagement between Muslim and evangelical Christian communities in the United States. She previously served as Associate Professor of Interreligious Education and Director of the Center for Global Peacebuilding at Claremont School of Theology, where she helped shape both the academic and practical dimensions of peace-building education. Her experience also spans executive leadership in community, higher education, and government settings, including work with the Western Justice Center Foundation and the Asian Pacific American Dispute Resolution Center. Furthermore, in 2021, she served as chief of staff to an elected member of the Los Angeles City Council, bringing a practitioner's lens to governance and public response in moments of conflicts. She also holds a law degree from Indiana University, so lots of qualifications and delving into many different, very contentious worlds. What distinguishes Najeeba's work is this: she doesn't treat dialogue as a destination. It's groundwork. What that means is that relationships are not simply built for understanding. They are built for response, for the moment when something happens. And the question isn't just, do we agree or can we agree? It's where are we going to show up for each other? And will we show up for each other? Today, drawing from recent events in Minnesota, amid heightened immigration enforcement, she will share what interfaith solidarity looks like under pressure and in action, when relationships are tested and when communities must decide whether and how to show up for one another. So for all of us in this field, the question beneath today's conversation is simple and at the same time, not simple at all. What are the relationships that we have built that can actually hold and help in difficult times? We're very grateful to be in this conversation together. Please join me in warmly welcoming, all the way from California, Professor Najeeba Syeed. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm in California. I just gave a talk yesterday at a conference actually on building relationships between Indians and Pakistanis. And India and Pakistan, as you can imagine, being at the nexus of international conflict. And so a group of students had organized a conference, and I was on a panel. We had a Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh panelists talking about faith and spirituality and mediation between our communities, but also talking about some of the dynamics that emerge when communities migrate to another country and bring with them some of the conflict issues that, of course, they've experienced. So I thought what was really interesting about that table yesterday was that often we think of interfaith spaces. I'm sort of sharing where I've been in the last 24 hours. I was at the Women's Philanthropy Conference in Chicago the day before, doing also interfaith engagement on a panel with myself, someone who was Jewish and someone who was Christian. So thinking about the ways in which faith and religion show up and the vast diversity of traditions at the table. In my own course that I teach the Interfaith Scholars course, Ethics and Practices of Care. I have Muslim students, Jewish students, and atheist students. So one of the things that I think is really important, I always tell people religion is always on the table for negotiation, whether you're doing, as I've done, mediated dozens, if not at this point, hundreds of cases, or showing up as someone who is doing peacemaking or peace building on the ground, or also doing restorative justice work, that sometimes religion is visible, but sometimes it's invisible. But it is always at the table. And I think one of the things I wanted to have us really remember is that what I'm talking about is not a unique topic. It's not a unique dynamic. Sometimes religion rises to the top in the negotiation. Sometimes it shows up later. What we are finding now in many conflicts around the world, even in societies or in spaces that were deemed highly secular, individuals identified as highly secular, that religion seems to pop up. And it seems random to individuals, but actually, very often religion is there under the surface, but people may not know how to talk about it, or it may be a dynamic that they themselves don't even know is still there. So I just wanted to point that out to people, that I'm hopeful that today's conversation isn't seen as a dynamic that we only bring up when we see someone particularly who has a different religious orientation than ourselves, or they're showing up in a way that religion looks different. Imagine, like, I'm wearing hijab, so someone might assume when I walk into the room that I'm bringing religion into the room, but in fact, it's already there. So I just wanted to start off with that. The first part of my conversation today will be, and then we'll take questions at the end, we'll be grounding a little bit in what we know or what I've experienced around religion, spirituality, and worldviews within conflict scenarios, whether I'm mediating, whether I'm a community-based leader, or intervening as a third-party consultant, as a process consultant in some way. And then what we'll be doing is talking a little bit, grounding it more in the most recent example. So for me, I think it's really important to think about three things that are assets for religion, spirituality, and worldview. And I use those three terms in my work, and the way that the Institute defines interfaith is that we show up sometimes as deeply religious people, a member of a congregation, someone for whom scriptural text may be very important. And so some folks identify with the description of being religious, and there are other people who show up with a far more, there's a term of spiritual but not religious is now an academic term, but other individuals who choose to identify more with a spiritual practice, or the way that they describe their identity might be more based on a spiritual description, and they may not utilize formal religious categories. And then the third way that we often talk about these identities showing up and dynamics within negotiation and mediation and conflict resolution is that people have a worldview that may be very strong. It may not be tied to a religious perspective. It may not be tied to a spiritual practice, but they have a very, very strongly identified worldview. And that's why a lot of the work that I've been doing, especially around depolarization with political viewpoints, it may be that some people identify their worldview from a religious center, some from a spiritual, but it doesn't mean that just because you don't have a name for your moral perspective on the earth, that it isn't just as important to you as a religious identity is for someone else. So I wanted to point that out, that a lot of as we're evolving and thinking about religion, spirituality, we've really added, at least in the work that I do, I've really added that notion of worldview. I have students that are extremely motivated by the climate crisis and their definition of it, and they don't have a religious or spiritual perspective, but they do show up with a very a very grounded worldview of how they think the world should look like. So all three are at play, and sometimes we're a mix of all of those. We also are living in a moment where people have hybrid religious identities, come from interfaith families. So I've worked with people that identify with more than one religious tradition, that may come from a family where they were raised by people of two different religious traditions. So there are many ways in which religion is showing up right now in people's identity, and that we can't really impose our own definition, our own self-understanding of religion as we experience it on others. And I think that's really important, where all of the skills that we have worked so hard on, active listening, become important to understand how people are defining their religious worldview. So there are really three assets that I think in any conflict scenario religion brings. And I would really encourage us to interrogate the notion that religion is always the cause of conflict and religion is always the cause of violence. There are many helpful books, such as The Myth of Religious Violence, and other books that you might want to explore. And I say that because I was brought into by a major national think tank that was working on an international conflict. And I had a staffer that said, Najeeba, I need you to come in and just convince the people who are doing the intervention, planning the track to diplomacy and intervention work, the community-based level. And this was in a conflict where war had already interrupted. And the reason the staffer brought me in was to say that those that are working in this situation to intervene, to resolve this conflict, think that religion is only a source of the problem. But what they're surprised by is the individuals who've been traumatized and experienced violence in this conflict are saying, wait, we want to return to our religious, spiritual belief systems to recover from the trauma of the conflict. So they were just baffled. What is going on here? Why are people who are so people who've been victimized by what seems to be a conflict caused by religion, why are they returning to a spiritual practice? Why are they exploring religion? Another case that I'll give you, if some of you will remember the tsunamis, the major tsunami that happened, the global tsunami, and I was talking to individuals who were offering counseling and services, and they were engaging with communities who said, actually, we have rituals of healing, we have spiritual teachers. And so this idea of bringing in a model of recovery that didn't include the indigenous spiritual communities' practices wasn't effective. So I think that's why I was saying religion is always at the table. And I think very often when we really only think about religion as maybe we don't see religion is one perspective as a factor in conflict intervention resolution. But there's also another way that in which um, we might see religion as only showing up in ways that are negative. So I really want us to think about our own perspectives. And sometimes it's understandable that we need to acknowledge the role of religion and its tie to violence. And I do think, though, sometimes our own experiences with religion, whether they were negative or positive, can influence how we show up, um, hopefully as a neutral. And so I really want us to think about what work are we doing on ourselves to prepare for engaging in conflict resolution, particularly when we have or may have had very deeply negative experiences with our own religious history. And that's completely understandable. Just, I think, being aware of that and being aware that participants and parties in the conflict may also be showing up with a negative experience or a negative history around religion and have been traumatized. So, having given all that disclaimer and talking about the notion and the reality that religion is utilized, instrumentalized, um, theologized, theorized as a cause for, in many cases, for violence. There's sort of three ways now that I think about spirituality, religion, and worldviews as showing up as instigators or dynamics or variables that could actually help in the process of peace building between parties in conflict. So one of them, and I'll ground them really in my own tradition, and this is what I encourage people to do, is ground these principles in your own tradition, your own worldview, and your spiritual practice. So the first one is, I talk about 3 C's: care, compassion, and community. And one of the powerful pieces around care is that there are so many religious and spiritual teachings and stories and scripture around care. And for instance, within the Muslim tradition, the oral tradition of Prophet Muhammad, the hadith, there's this often repeated hadith that says one cannot be a believer if you are comfortable, or if you go to sleep, or you know that your neighbor is hungry. And so that idea of care, and what's beautiful about so many different religious traditions, I teach across multiple traditions, including indigenous traditions, is that care is often not one that is articulated as being centered only on people of your own religious background, people of your own community, people of who look like you, people of your national identity. So religion or religions or spirituality and worldviews can become mechanisms by which people exhibit care. We were just talking about all of the holidays, whether it's Passover, Nowruz, Ramadan, Lent, that these are times where we express and engage within the Muslim tradition. Ramadan is a heightened time of charity, a heightened time of giving and sharing our wealth to alleviate the pain of others who are suffering from lack of access to food, lack of access to resources. So thinking about the practices within your own tradition, if you identify with a religious tradition, what are the practices of care? And I really think it's important that we think about care not just as an emotional or affect, or I think of it as a behavioral system. So how is your religious practice, your spiritual identity, how is it encouraging you in the practice of care, not just in the belief that others should be cared for, but the carrying out? We know that internationally, it is really religious communities that show up in humanitarian disasters and crisis. So just as an example, I also I spent some time in Los Angeles. My daughter was still in high school there. So the fires in Altadena happened a year ago, and in the Pacific Palisades. And within less than a couple of months, tens of thousands of people were rehoused. It's a conversation we don't talk about. Tens of thousands of people were rehoused through the efforts of many spiritual and religious communities. So care is in the DNA of many religious traditions, spiritual communities, and moral and ethical spaces. The second one is this idea of compassion. And within the Muslim tradition, compassion we define as rahma. For those that speak Hebrew, it's a similar term, rahma, and it actually derives or comes from the same root for where we talk about the womb. And so this idea that compassion is a religious spiritual value, and that for Muslims, this idea that one of the ways in which Prophet Muhammad is described in the Holy Scripture of Muslims, the Quran, is being a source of rahmah or compassion to all human beings. Again, compassion, just like care, is not exhibited just for people who look like us, for people who sound like us, for people who are the same, but it's compassion for all. And other traditions, we can think of Jewish teachings around Tikkun Olam, the healing of the world. Think about notions from Buddhist communities and traditions around interbeing, where compassion is extended not just to the human being or to animal beings, but to other beings that are in the natural world. And thinking about figures like Jesus, I have a brother named Jesus, Isa. He's also a revered prophet within the Muslim tradition, sitting and expressing and showing compassion for people who are at the margins of society, for people who, for instance, you can think of one of the beautiful notions of compassion is sitting at that time with people who were experiencing the disease of leprosy. So he expressed compassion, and I talk about compassion in my work as embodied empathy or embodied compassion, that it's not just that Jesus was in his practice was saying, I feel this way about those that are experiencing a very difficult situation, but showed up for them, walked with them, was there with them. The last is community. And I think community shows up in ways that allows us to relate to one another, and religious communities in the end have a communal element. That is the element that can also be utilized for violence. That is the element that can be um, utilized to bring people together as for a common enemy. It can also be utilized to bring people together to show up for one another. And that's something I would encourage you, if you're interested in what has been happening in Minneapolis and St. Paul and across the state of Minnesota. I wrote a piece within, I think, the first 24 hours of our loss of Renee Good, and I talked about what in that article I termed a lived theology of neighborliness, and that lived theology of neighborliness was one in which we showed up with religious conviction, but the object of that compassion, of that empathy, was the neighbor. And that category of neighbor is so important in conflict management, interfaith solidarity, developing allyship, because that neighbor becomes the object of how we think about showing up for one another. The neighbor also, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't have to be from my tradition, doesn't have to be someone I know. I may never have met this neighbor, but if you come to Minnesota and you talk to people about what the last now 4 months have been like, everyone describes their motivation for whom they're showing up as their neighbor. And I think this category is important because it is also the foundation of how we build place-based, meaning place-based within the place that we're in, grounded practices and rituals of empathy and care for one another. And more, the erosion of this category of neighbor is prevalent when we're atomizing into devices where we're relating to one another in ways that are through means that don't have that connection of neighborliness. And I think what's unique to Minnesota is also that someone was saying, well, maybe people are really kind to each other because it's cold. And I think there might actually be some wisdom in that whatever place we come from is deeply influenced by cultural practices as well. So religion doesn't always show up just as a belief system. Religion can also show up as a cultural practice. So, one of the things that I have been really touched by is thinking about how religion shows up in ways in which we can think about neighborliness in the past, neighborliness in how we created our communities, our country, but we also think about neighborliness in the future. And that's part of why in all many conflict scenarios that I now work in, I do a lot of future-oriented work. The work that I do with the past, I've described as re-mythologizing, where I bring people together and we engage and do appreciative inquiry of times in which these communities did collaborate, did coexist, because the way that history is often written is punctuated by the wars. Think about how we know American history. Think about how you know your own religious history. It's really taught in ways in which who was the victor and it's written from the victor's perspective, whomever often won whatever that form of violence was. But what I'll do in that interrogation of the past is say, well, where were times in which there was coexistence? What were the religious belief systems? But even more deeply, what were the practices that were supporting you to care for one another? So that's in my work, I call that remythologizing about the past. And I've been doing that for more than almost at this point 30 years in my own work. And more, I've been thinking about the future. And one of the questions that I'll ask people is, are you in each other's futures when I'm mediating conflicts? Um, how do you see a collective future? Do you see yourselves in each other's futures? Because one of the things that spirituality and religion can do is help us think about, one of the beautiful parts of Dr. King's speech, I have a dream. It's been truncated. Now I think people utilize it in commercials, but there's something about the future-oriented perspective of, and he, as you know, one of his last sermons was about knowing he wasn't going to see that future in a prescient way. Unfortunately, as we know, he was assassinated. There's something about that visionary part of our many prophets of many traditions, the perspective of being able to, one of my mentors in the field of gang mediation and intervention, Bobby Arias, says, to do this work, you have to be irrational. Dr. King's dream was an irrational dream. To be mediators and to think about a future that is going to be hopeful. I was thinking about some of the tables that I've been at when I'm mediating, and if I lose hope, if I get deflated, if I stop being a cheerleader for optimism, everyone deflates. And so I think particularly one of the beauties of of religion and how it can show up is to re-engage the notion that there is a vision of society that is still possible, and spirituality and religion become fuels for us to get to that place together. A prophetic vision, whether it's Dr. King's vision, whether it's your vision as an individual in a situation. And I think that category of what does it mean to be neighbors right now? How were we neighbors in the past? And how and what will it look like to be neighbors in the future? The other thing that I think is really important is another question that I talk about a lot in the work that I do is thinking about who is human. What is the category of human? And religion is and has been used to dehumanize others, but there's also a way in which religion can give us the ability, and I utilize my own tradition, and I utilize it only because I think it's important to demonstrate how we bring that conflict hermeneutic or conflict intervention lens back to our own traditions. And so I encourage you to do the same with your own, in your own tradition, your own language, your own lexicon, your own theological form of inquiry. So this idea that the category of human, particularly within the Muslim tradition, is that every human being is given a dignity that is granted not by other humans, that is not taken away by other humans, but it is part of the form of the creation of the human being, the human body, that every person has dignity. So sometimes that belief that every person is worthy of dignity, and whatever that may come from, it, thinking about the ways in which we talk about every human is created in some traditions, created in the likeness of God. For others, in the Hindu tradition, when you say namaste, you are greeting the divine in the other. So many religious traditions talk about this notion of the human form, the human body, the creation of human beings, the soul, if you see soul as a category. So thinking about, well, how do we show up with recognizing dignity? And one of the reasons that has been so important in the work in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and across the state is it is religious leaders that are saying, you know what? whatever your citizenship status is, whatever your national origin is, whatever your economic output is to society, as a moral, spiritual, and religious person, that is not how I see your humanity. Your humanity is a sacred element of your very existence. So when we live in a moment that is divisive, that seeks to divide us in categories and put some people in the category of non-human, less than, or takes on and seeks collective punishment against a whole group of people for the acts of a few, it is the re-engagement with religious and spiritual traditions that renews the commitment to the collective dignity and humanity of individuals. So, in fact, religion can show up as a motivation, as a we talked earlier about community, about care and compassion, and it can serve as the foundation for building a just peace. Many of you may have read the work of Glenn Stassen, Susan Thistlethwaite, and many others. Another book I would recommend is Interfaith Just Peacemaking, in which every chapter, the 10 principles that Glenn had originally developed, we had a Muslim, a Jewish, and a Christian author respond to those principles, the 10 principles of just peacemaking from our own religious traditions, utilizing our texts and practices as peace builders. So just another tool in the toolbox is this idea of interfaith just peacemaking that is really grounded in the notion that the dignity of humanity is something that religious and spiritual traditions do share. So interfaith just peacemaking. So I wanted to take us a little bit into a journey of Minneapolis and St. Paul and the whole state of Minnesota, and just to let you sort of to think a little bit and set the scene. I teach at a university, Augsburg University, a Lutheran institution, ELCA, for those of you that are familiar with denominations of Protestant Christianity. I am the first Muslim woman to receive tenure at the institution, so it is a historically affiliated Christian institution. It is also in a state. The state of Minneapolis has the highest per capita refugee population in the country. It's a small state. The population doesn't exceed. It's under 7 million. But per capita, what that means is the state has received and been open to per capita more refugees seeking to resettle than any other state in the country. And so the percentage is very small overall of refugees and immigrants, particularly immigrants that came through the resettlement programs. However, it is clear that it is actually religious communities that played a role in that welcoming. So whether it was Catholic or Lutheran Family Services, it was often Christian hospitality that welcomed individuals. And the university where I teach is in Cedar Riverside, which is the largest Somali neighborhood in the world outside of Mogadishu, the largest concentration. And so what's also fascinating about this neighborhood is it was a gateway for immigrants coming to the United States. So in this moment, it happens to be largely East African Muslims that are in that transition of now second and even third generations of migration to this country. We do a walking tour of the neighborhood in my first day of Interfaith Scholars class, and we also point out where there was a synagogue at one time. So it was a neighborhood that welcomed Eastern European Jewish communities at another time. It was a neighborhood that welcomed Asian American immigrants. So in the past, there were stores as well as businesses that East Asian communities in their migration to the U.S. utilized. It was a neighborhood that welcomed Norwegian and other immigrants generations ago. So, thinking about this idea of migration as a part of the American story, but also part of the story of Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the whole state, that in this moment we have a current community that has migrated, and there are many other communities that are part of that neighborhood. We see remnants in the buildings, we see remnants in the stores, we see remnants in the memories, but they were there and they are there in many ways. And they are part of the future since they were a part of the making of that neighborhood. Um, our institution is one that is the US News and World Report called it the most ethnically diverse regional institution in the Midwest. In addition to having the largest, we're about 16% Muslim, out of which a very large portion of those Muslim students are Somali. We have the largest percentage of Somali students for a private institution, independent institution in the state of Minnesota. We also have a very substantial population of Hmong students, Southeast Asian students. We're also located just not many blocks away from a large concentration of Native American institutions and neighborhoods, and we also have an increasingly and growing Native American student population. We are also an institution that is home to West African students, as well as a substantial Latino and Latino identified student population. So we have a wide diversity of students. We also have many students who are the descendants of Norwegian immigrants as well. The tie to the Lutheran Church is very much still there, and the history of that, as well as Catholic immigrants and many others. So the institution is very diverse. So one of the ways that we can think about why interfaith solidarity is so important and how religion shows up. And today, as I mentioned, the goal is to identify or think about or um, be able to engage religion and spirituality, particularly around motivating communities to problem solve with one another. And I think one of the really fascinating parts of what's been happening in Minnesota is that there is this notion of not just doing the work through digital organizing, but scholars are now saying that one of the great successes of the interfaith solidarity is that people have been showing up in person. So some of the vigils, some of the marches, some of the ways in which people have been showing up, when you hear 100,000 people showing up in a combined in a city that is less than 600,000 people, that is a mass mobilization. One immigrant rights organization says that at least 30,000 people have been trained to be constitutional observers. Um, that's a very large portion of a population that is quite small when you think about the numbers of people that are showing up. I encourage you, if you haven't read the work of Jewish philosopher Levinas, one of the things Levinas talks about is empathy being built from being face to face. That empathy and dignity are something that we achieve. And you know that, I know that, for those of us that do mediation and conflict resolution. My resolution rate after people are at the table, it's getting them to the table. That's the biggest challenge. But once people are at the table, the magic, the work, and whether that table is, a virtual one, whether that table is in person. But Levinas has this really beautiful reflection about the notion of it's the human faces in interaction with one another. And I point that out because it has been so amazing to see the ways in which people have been showing up. So after Alex Preddy was killed, within a day, there was a call. It started from a Quaker tradition. I actually went to a Quaker college. It started from a community of Quakers that said, just light a candle. just light a candle in memory of this beautiful human being that this community has lost. You could drive around the city of Minneapolis. People just organically were coming out with candles to street corners. People were lighting candles in the windows of their homes. So sometimes the ways in which people show up are organic, but they are physically showing up. They are getting out there. They are being a part of the larger collective. And so I mention that because it's not just the symbolic notion of showing up that is important. And I think scholars are going to be writing about Minneapolis as a watershed moment of the modern context, reinvigorating the notion of showing up for your neighbor in person and doing that face-to-face interaction. So I wanted to really just share that as one of the observations of how we show up for one another, and really encouraging us to think about solidarity as showing up in that embodied form. So that's why I talked about this as a lived theology of neighborliness. And that part of that neighborliness is that embodied empathy in showing up. The other thing that we found that is important is, in this moment in particular, I had offered testimony last semester, I can't keep track of time anymore. I had offered testimony a couple of weeks ago for a Norwegian public hearing on how to engage and work with immigrant communities. And one of the things that we found out is that faith leaders, and I really want you to expand your definition of faith leaders, because, you know, I was just on a panel with women who were faith leaders. There are some religious traditions like my own where women have roles, but we may not be ordained as clergy. So within the Catholic tradition, you see and there are some religious traditions like Baha'is, like Quakers, that don't have clergy. But to think about religious leaders, I talk very often in my work as who are the religious actors, who are the religious change agents. They may not be formal clergy all the time. And I would really encourage us to think beyond the interfaith dialogue or interfaith conversations that bring together the formal imam, the rabbi, and the priest. That's a beautiful model. We need that. We should continue it. And also think about people who may not have formal religious authority, because as Elise Boulding, one of my mentors who since passed away, and advanced the notion of cultures of peace, and especially talked about the role of women and children in peacemaking, it's often, and we know women in many conflicts, I often will say it's been women that have crossed the lines of barriers, whether those lines are geographic barriers or religious barriers. It is often women who have lost a child to violence that will be the first to cross the line. So whether it's doing gang intervention in Los Angeles or flying all the way to another country where I'm doing conflict resolution, it's the people who are doing the work of peace building are often the ones who are deeply impacted. And Atin Anwar writes about this notion of women as peacemakers in her work in Southeast Asia. So I just wanted to have us really think about this notion of who is a religious leader, who is a religious actor, and that it may look very different depending on the community. So what we found in Minnesota is that religious leaders, religious actors, they offer structures that are beyond structures. So there is the structure of a neighborhood. There is a structure of government. Thinking about Johan Galtung's work on structural violence, there are many structures that exist. And in this moment of crisis, when neighbors were afraid to leave their homes, religious leaders were often the bond between vast gaps of geography or structures that weren't in place or didn't exist. It was the pastor, it was the rabbi, it was the grandmother in a community who, through her spiritual, religious community, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about care, compassion, and community. that she was able to mobilize people, that she was able to say, oh, you're in that neighborhood, you're organizing in Longfellow, I'm here in Powderhorn, but I happen to know, I'm just giving you an example of a pastor. My church is in this neighborhood, and I have congregants from across all these neighborhoods. So it was often religious leaders that were able to utilize the structures that are created out of their organic communities that became powerful connectors. And that social capital, thinking of Putnam's work on social capital, that social capital in this moment of crisis became a huge and important asset of connection. So they were able to offer structures beyond structures. The other space, whether this was, I was mentioning Altadena fires, the Los Angeles fires a year ago, or now in this crisis in Minneapolis, or in the floods that happened in eastern Tennessee and North Carolina, religious spaces became gathering places. So the structures, the physical structures, I'll just give you an example. One of the immediately after the rise in anti-Somali rhetoric, it reached a high pitch point in late November, early December, to the degree which my students began to be afraid to go out and be in the wider community. It was an imam, a religious leader from the Muslim community, who, in his relationship with a pastor, hosted a meeting at a church. And this was in early December. And dozens of people showed up, many of them not connected to the pastor, not connected to the imam, but they showed up, and a safe place, a neutral place, a place that was seen as sacred became a gathering place. And in fact, in many of the actions that were taken to support neighbors, it is religious spaces. I even talk about the notion of parking lots as relief places where people are organizing, putting goods together, having gatherings to share. It wasn't even just the structure of the church, the mosque, the religious space, but even by extension. Think about the resources that these buildings, these parking lots offer, free, available. And that's a huge resource when you're trying to organize mutual aid. Minnesotans, since the advent of the rise in immigration enforcement, have raised $8 million, according to people who are trying to gather the data, at least around $8 million in relief and mutual aid for one another. And they've done that all through their organizing, whether it's in person or online and otherwise. So imagine $8 million within 2 to 3 months to support their neighbors. So I think that is the other element that's very important to think about when we think about community. So taking you back to that church in that moment, early December, the people that showed up also showed up because of that ethic and practice of care. There's really a story I'll never forget, just this image of being in a church in South Minneapolis. An imam and a pastor have called people together, and a rabbi shows up. And the rabbi shares in that moment this story that really struck me. It was within a couple of days of the rhetoric and what would foreshadow, we didn't know the number of losses of life and other things that have since happened. A rabbi said something to the effect of, I showed up today and I'm going to be bringing my congregation into this work. And in this case, she was talking the Latino Christian and other community, the Latino community is deeply impacted by what's been happening in Minneapolis and across the state. She was showing up in that moment, since we were in a Somali neighborhood, mostly Somali neighborhood. She said something that really sticks with me. At the invitation of a pastor and an imam, she said, I'm showing up here today and I'll continue to show up because I have experienced, or my community has experienced, what your community is going through now. So this idea of empathy being related also to our historical experiences of of um, of marginalization and otherwise, and she was showing up and she said, because I'm Jewish, that is a part of my religious conviction that I show up for another community in addition to the realities that my community has experienced. So I wanted to share that story because it is interfaith and the solidarity is religiously based. And it happened in a space convened by people of other religious traditions. And I think more and more what is profound about Minnesota and the experience is that this is a story that happened in the heartland of the United States. So it is not a new thing that is manifesting. It's part of the history of America, that we've shown up for one another, that we, are able to, when needed, show up for other communities, show up in other spaces. His rabbi showed up in a church. There isn't a question that that was something she would do. And when her neighbors who are Muslim were suffering, that she showed up. So it's not something, that this organically was a part of the ways in which people showed up for neighbors. So I think that it's really important the ways in which we tell the stories um, of our communities is that cooperation, collaboration, and care have always been there, and that this was a new moment for it to happen. But it isn't a new phenomenon. It isn't a new element. And one of the other pieces that I think was really important during this time, I have a student who's an atheist, and in the rise of the realities of immigration enforcement, the number of enforcement agents went up to, the estimation is, I don't know, usually as far as I've read, it was 115. It seems that it went up to at least 3,000 at one point for a city of less than 1 million. So just imagining the mobilization, that I had an atheist student, and the student, one of my colleagues who runs clinics from our nursing department, texted me a picture in the midst of all of these really difficult moments, sent me a picture of one of my students who's atheist, who showed up for a clinic that caters largely to Somali and Latino communities, to immigrant communities. And she said the student came in the midst of all of everything that's happening and said, I need to show up and support our neighbors in care. And I thought that was really profound because it shows that whether you are religious or not, your conviction can come from your worldview of humanitarianism. And that's what the student has said consistently to me that they were motivated by. And so it's important to remember that religion is an element that shows care, and that people who don't have a religious conviction can also show up for care. The other thing that is really important is to not characterize compassion and care as only a progressive religious value. Certainly, progressive religious movements, progressive religious leaders were very much a part and at the forefront of a lot of the work. And I wanted to point out that Catholic, as well as Latter-day Saints, as well as evangelical churches, all of those communities have mobilized some of the most important relief work around food distribution was organized by churches that were both Latino and evangelical. 1 in 7 evangelicals in the United States is a person from a non-white background. So I just want to point out that we also need to be very careful that the lens of generosity, the lens of engagement, of civic engagement, of community care, of mutual care, is not seen as something that only one iteration or worldview of religion embodies. And so I wanted to point that out. So we saw the mobilization of people of many different religious communities, orientations, backgrounds were showing up, in addition to those that had and espouse what might be seen as more progressive and liberal viewpoints of religion, and people who are deeply religious and have viewpoints. And I think this is important because we live in a moment where we need narratives that depolarize us, and narratives that show that people showed up for their neighbors. They didn't ask the question when people were bringing food to people's homes who were scared to leave their homes. They didn't ask who they voted for. They didn't ask who was, what is your brand of political identity? What is your background? So not only can spiritual and religious communities serve, they also can unify and bring people together for a common purpose. I think in this moment, those of us that work on conflict mediation, we know that some of the biggest divides in our nation are also deeply divisive based on political orientation. So this was a moment when people came together across their spiritual and religious belief systems, wherever they might have been on the political spectrum. Not ideally, not in the cleanest, easiest ways sometimes, but it did happen, and humanitarian impulses were there and present across many communities. One of the other things that I think was really important is that there is often this notion of when there is a major conflict that happens, that religious communities show up in protest. There's absolutely the case that some of what was important for the visibilization of of the humanitarian and human rights issues as people perceive them was through things like marches. Many people who showed up were never activists in the past. They showed up for what they saw as neighborly care. So some of the examples were school sites when it became clear that some immigrant children and their families were afraid to walk to school, or children were afraid to walk to school. It was grandmothers and grandparents and community members that may never go to a march or never showed up at a march and never protested. The way that they were motivated, and many motivated by spiritual and religious um, uh, sentiment, showed up to walk children to school. When it became clear that there were people and women who were scared to engage in medical care, that there were, for instance, people of different religious backgrounds that organized and started to do home visits. There are doulas that organize. There's a whole group of nursing mothers that organize to share milk with mothers who were dealing with in lack of accessibility for newborns to breast milk. So people were showing up for others with the resources that they had. If I had friends that could speak Spanish and were offering translation services. There were people, when people were being released, there's a group called Haven Watch, a Christian group that showed up and started noticing that when people were released, they didn't have a phone, they didn't have a jacket, they were freezing. So people just started gathering, and when people were being released from immigration detention or whatever the case may be, there were people showing up with a jacket. And it started off, maybe some people were Christian, but it became an interfaith practice. So it was very common when we would be just walking or going to have coffee. Someone would say, "Oh, I'm on my way to go I have some jackets. Do you have socks?" People were just doing this mutual aid organically and naturally. And so people were showing up in different ways. The other thing we learned is that part of interfaith solidarity is to recognize that people have different roles, that people have different ways in which they show up. Some folks are very motivated around the human rights issues. They became constitutional observers. They engaged in ways in which they felt safe. And I think what was really profound about the Minnesota example is that there was a recognition that for people who don't feel safe, that we show up and support them, and that also ways in which hospitality was demonstrated in an interfaith manner. So if you look up, there's some great articles that are talking about sambusa and chai hospitality. So I'll just give you an example. If you were to go to a vigil, you might walk across, and I wanted to mention this, you might walk across so many forms of religion and spirituality that came together And you might walk across or see the opening of a program where Native American dancers were using ancestral dances for healing and witness and sacred witness. And then this is literally a scene that was described. And then you'll see a Somali auntie who will be coming with sambusa and chai. So sambusas are this triangular food. For those of you who I'm South Asian, in our culture, it's samosa in South Asian culture, and chai, tea, spicy tea, Somali tea. If you haven't had it, I would encourage you. And they would just circulate. And in this one space, then you would have a pastor doing an opening prayer. Then you would have a rabbi that would also join. Then you would have an imam. So all of these different kinds of practices were spiritual, but they're also those practices of hospitality, practices of cultural recognition that hospitality is important, and that diversity of practices happening within a block or two of one another. There were places that were used as warming houses where people could leave an action or leave a site in which they were supporting their neighbors and get a cup of coffee. I don't know how many free cups of coffee so many of us were able to have. So not only were religious and spiritual spaces activated, but small businesses became places where people were supporting one another. And what I wanted to point out about this activation of whole communities is that we were able to move from this notion of someone being a stranger to someone being a neighbor. And, you know, when I was offering some of this, these stories to people in Norway, they couldn't imagine that there were people that people weren't able to get food or experiencing so much fear that they weren't leaving their homes. And I wanted to share two stories of generosity of my own students that really were profound. So in this moment, I had a student who two students who had grown up themselves in refugee camps with very little in their lives. So what really moved me about the story of these two students, they both happen to be Muslims. What really moved me about their stories was that they came with very little. And one of the students told me that they were so afraid to leave their home without all of their immigration documentation with them and carrying it with them. And it really struck me that here's a student that's experienced so much loss, but they were still motivated. And they said, you know, Professor Syeed, I feel like I'm living in a time that in other times where, in other times in history, in 1939 in Germany, where people had to carry papers. And he was just saying that, what does it mean to feel that you have to carry papers to validate your right to exist or be in a space? And in the same breath is telling me, by the way, I'd like to organize students to continue to make hygiene kits for our unhoused neighbors. I'm organizing students to make 2,000 of those hygiene kits. And I'm thinking, here's a student in this moment that themselves is so afraid, so concerned, comes from a history of loss, and is motivated to help people even in this moment. So that was one beautiful story, is how do we show generosity and how do we engage in that care, that compassion in ways when we are even so much ourselves threatened. And it was really their spiritual and religious belief that gave them the motivation, the fuel, the courage, the care, and gave them what is really important, is a relational ethic of care for another. We had another student, also a former refugee, and commissioned the student for an exhibit that we were working on around generosity. And the student, I know, also had been dealing with major issues of fear. There's been major economic loss across the cities because people have been afraid to leave. So restaurants, small business owners. For those of you that do landlord-tenant mediation, we actually engage in a process. I wasn't directly involved, but help advise on how that process was developed between tenants who were in back rent because their stores closed because no one was there. We were able to build a culture of compassion with the landlord of multiple stores to be able to resolve the conflict in a way that the tenants were able to keep their properties. Because if you have lost 3 months of business, then it's a spiraling for a whole family that loses their livelihood. And so this student, one of the things that was really powerful was she was offered a stipend for the work that she had legitimately done on this project. And she said, no, Professor Syeed, I want that stipend to go to someone who is dealing with issues of economic loss, of food insecurity. And that was really moving to me. And both of them, when I think about their stories, these are people from the ages of 17 to 20. They're young people. And they had experienced so much loss, and yet they were willing to show up and care for one another and were motivated by their spiritual beliefs. And, one of the other stories that has been important to me is that people are not just showing up for their own communities. I was in the basement of one of my friends who is a Somali Muslim woman, and she said, oh, wait, that kind of meat or that kind of product, Muslims, similar to Jewish communities, many Muslims only will eat meat that has a particular ritual associated with how that meat is processed and sacrificed. So she said, well, you know what, let's make sure that our Latino Christian neighbors can that might be something that would work for them. So not only was she thinking about her own community, but she was thinking about other communities. What has been so healing in Minneapolis for so many people that I talked to, for Muslims, I was just in another circle before I left on Friday, and it was a circle of largely, in that case, it was Somali Muslim women talking about the relief services around housing, around food insecurity and other elements. And what they all said was that they were so moved by people of other religious communities that showed up. There is a synagogue and a church that together have raised $1 million for people facing or needing rental assistance because of the housing insecurity conditions that have been created by the lack and the interruption of the economy in the Twin Cities. So I'm really moved by that, ways in which people utilized and thought about those structures beyond structures of religious and spiritual communities to motivate, support, and help. And one of the pieces, and I'll end with this because I think there'll be some discussion. I think the cornerstone of any healthy democracy is a multi-religious, multiracial community. And what is the glue that holds us together? There is so much that can divide us in this moment. There is so much in which we could show up with a viewpoint of our religious, spiritual worldview that would say, I'm here and I'm showing up in a way because I I want to be the dominant narrative. I want to take over the conversation. I want to utilize my spiritual beliefs to advance them against anyone else taking up space. What I saw in this moment wasn't as much the notion just of protest or the notion of, as I mentioned, it was really community care. It was my neighbor is dealing with something. So I wanted to encourage all of us to think about ways in which we are in relationship across religious diversity and religious pluralism. Because if we're not in relationship with others in times of peace, let's not wait till we know in this moment anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. Let's not wait until there's an act of violence against a synagogue to show up for that community, to get to know that community. Because if we're already in relationship with that community, then you knock on the door when that crisis has happened and the door will open. So I'm just giving you as an example around the rise in anti-Semitism. So if we have and build that relational ethic of care before a crisis, people are much more likely to show up for one another. So what I would say in Minnesota and Minneapolis, that it has been part of the DNA of how people have related to one another. Certainly much of this is new. I also wanted to point out that during, for instance, many Black church leaders and also African-American Muslims that are non-East African offered many of the communities networks and ways in which since the George Floyd the George Floyd the George Floyd unrest in the cities, that there were networks that were created and activated around mutual care that were already in existence. So many different religious and spiritual communities were in relationship with one another, and so they were able to show up in this moment. So that's kind of another part of what I wanted to have us think about, is not just crisis response, not just engaging when there is a crisis, but are we in relationship? Are we building pathways of knowing one another in moments where the eruption of some form of a humanitarian disaster, a fire, or in this case, fear that gripped people to the point that they didn't want to leave their homes? How do we build those networks, those webs of relationships, so that when that happens, we can show up for one another? And I think one of the other questions we have to ask when we do this work is, how do we build trust? And that's really where I think our profession as mediators, as conflict resolvers, we know what it's like to build trust and conflict. So not only are we in relationship, but are we building communities of care and trust before a crisis erupts? And what are we doing as a profession to support that work? And I think about this from that professional hat too, is thinking about what and how does our profession, whatever, and there are multiple professions at the table, I don't think there's just one, how do we engage religion and spirituality and bridge building and peace building in ways that are very much responsive to the moment, that are on the ground, that are useful for individuals, that don't have barriers of participation, so that, you know, our services are accessible to those that need it in that moment. And I have to say, my hope, and I will end with this, is that what became a humanitarian crisis also became a moment in which we humanize people for one another. And I actually think whether it's in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Los Angeles, that the moments in which people have been showing up, the skills that you and I have are what will be able to sustain moving from just an interpersonal connection into Galtung's notion of structural ways in which we can build peace and cultures of peace that outlast the divisiveness and the hatred that seems to be motivated to utilize a moment, so that we will not see one another and see each other's humanity and care for one another, have compassion for one another, and build beyond just my own community into a multi-faith, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. So ultimately, this is the core of our democratic work together, and the future of our nation hinges on it. So I'll take questions now.
Thank you so much for such an amazing presentation, so rich with many things. I was trying to pull out a few just quotes, and as people get ready to raise their hands and ask their questions live, you've got a lot of applause so far. I'll just ask some of the questions that have been posted thus far to give everybody a chance to get their their whistles wet and ask live. So one question early on from Lillian was, how do we navigate the difference between the myth of religious violence and the manipulation of religion to incite violence?
Yeah, can you repeat the question? I just want to ruminate on it for a second just to make sure I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a deep and heavy one. We don't ask light
Yeah,
questions in this community. The question was
good.
how do we navigate the difference between the myth of religious violence that you I think talked about when you were talking about remythologizing history and the coexisting reality of the manipulation of religion to incite violence.
So I would really reference Hal Saunders' work, if those of you Hal Saunders' work on sustained dialogue. If you're not familiar with it, I really encourage you to look at it, because one of the realities is we can't debunk, unpack those myths unless we have time. So it's important that we engage and think about one conflict situation that I was working on between two communities. Took 2 years of dialogue, literally 2 years. And the 2 years of dialogue was we were meeting twice a month, I think. So this was a really serious commitment of engagement and conversation. One of the practices that I did with those two communities around remythologizing was to do a timeline project where we took, and so this was two communities in the Los Angeles area. So what we did is we did a timeline, about 100-year timeline of that of those two neighborhoods, and we put up incidences, we put up occurrences, but we also talked about these vast periods of time where people had examples of cooperation and collaboration. And the questions we asked were, what were those elements that allowed you to cooperate and collaborate? And what we began to see is that it's not just the myth of religious violence, but it's also the myth that peace is created through elements that are also extra religious, meaning outside of religious issues or religious belief systems. So that there were times in which cooperation happened because there were a common cause of civil rights that the two communities were working on, that economic opportunities were more evenly distributed amongst those communities. So I encourage you to think about how religion is a part of the mythology, and unpacking it is understanding the other causes of both violence and cooperation. So, for instance, one of the things that had been really helpful in those conversations was to understand that when there was a vast level of economic disparity between communities, when there were points of economic depression, like literally the Great Depression, it introduced a kind of competition between these groups and these communities in these neighborhoods because resources were lacking. And so one of the ways we unpack the myth of religious violence is to understand the many causes of violence, and that many of those causes are actually quite perennial and quite universal across cultures and society. That when you have great economic disparity between groups, when you have lack of access to human rights across communities, and those are not things that religion always plays a role in. It can, but it doesn't always play a role. And so it means any solution that is going to be generated for any type of conflict, that it has to include elements that are not just religious also. So, for instance, is there a solution that in which people feel, we think about the durability of agreements. Do they have a sense that the outcome is going to be durable, not just because it includes religion or religion was a part of the conflict, but I would say many conflicts around the world that seem religious in their in their discourse are actually caused by distribution or access to resources. One of the biggest causes of conflicts in the future is going to be access to water. We already know that. That's becoming very clear that water will be as important a resource as oil in the future. So thinking about these types of ways in which whatever agreement phase we're getting to, that it's not just the notion of religion, but we are unpacking the current myth of a conflict that seems to be activated by religion. But in fact, when you dig deeper, the ways in which people are organized, there might be affiliations that are not religious, or there might be realities that are not caused by religion. And religion, trying to get people to just come together and have a dialogue about religion, will not address the structural elements in which religious beliefs may not even play a role. So both as part of the resolution and the cause, I think religion is important to activate, but it's also important to know when it's not actually the major force that was the cause or will be the best, will be the only or the major source of the resolution.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer, and I love that notion of being curious archaeologists as we're kind of dissecting and investigating the history and seeing where there are lines or commonalities or reasons in addition to or other than religion that might explain the history and help navigate the future. I'm going to follow up with a really simple question from that complex one. Megan wanted you to repeat the name of your mentor who had talked about women and
Oh,
children as
Elise
key
Boulding.
peacemakers. Oh, sorry. Say it
Elise
again.
Boulding. Elise Boulding, and I have a really great story. I was a freshman at a Quaker college in North Carolina. I've been really motivated to be a peace builder since the age of 17 or 16. So she came to give a lecture my freshman year. I'm about 4 foot, probably 11 now. We all shrink as we age. I think I used to be 5'1". She was almost 6 feet tall, and I share that just for the imagery. And she's a Quaker scholar, and she a scholar of nonviolence, and she has multiple books about engaging women and cultures of peace. And she gave the lecture, and someone told her there's a young Muslim woman, the only Muslim woman we have right now on campus at this Quaker college. She's 17. She's interested in being a peace builder. She came to my dorm and met me in the lounge at our dorm saying, I want you to know that I'm here to support your work as a peace builder. And so thinking about I'm a peace builder partly because someone who was Christian showed an act of empathy and care and love, an eminent scholar. So just thinking about these two people meeting, a 4'11" and 6 foot person. And I was 17 by that time, and she has since passed away. She was Elise Boulding. She was closer to the end of her life. And it was just a beautiful way to say, I'm here. I see you. You're a freshman in college, but you have a future. So, I mean, she's not here with us, but in many ways I was formed as a peacemaker by people of other religious traditions, not just my own. Jenny Peace talks about this in her work as co-formation, that sometimes we're formed in our practice, in our own tradition, by someone of another religious tradition. I'm a sought-after advisor, you would be surprised, by Jewish students as well, and Christian students, because they see that I hold on to my belief systems while also being a professional, and they want to know how to navigate that. So you never know. You never know who will show up for you. And part of showing up is exactly what Elise did for me. So her embodied empathy became part of my scholarship.
Thank you so much. We are 2 minutes away, and I fear we might not have a time for another question. There were a couple more in the chat. We always upload the public chat alongside the recordings of these sessions as a resource, and so you're welcome to peruse, and I can even draw them out and send them to you, and maybe we can keep the conversation going offline, because again, as you speak of, we really try to be a resource in a community that builds peace and connection throughout all the ups and downs of whatever each of us are experiencing in the moment. But I just want to take this opportunity before I give the mic back to Maria to thank you so much for joining us in the dark of night, in the shaking hills of Silicon Valley, to come to us and share so much of your really meaningful work. Maria, do you have a bit of a word before we give you the absolute last word?
Yeah, thank you so much, Najeeba. This has been truly refreshing and inspirational, and it couldn't be a more important topic for this era that we're living in. What a timely talk this has been. I can't thank you enough, and add to everyone's appreciation that you'll see in the chat once you have access to it. After all these years, I'm just so excited that you're still doing this work, and it's as refreshing today as it was in the 90s. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, we are going to sign off for this morning. Thank you, everyone, for coming. See you next month. Our speaker will be David Hoffman, and we will be posting it on all of the listservs and websites.
Wishing everybody happy holidays and a great continuation into the weekend. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you all on our next month's meeting. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Nikki, do you have the chat?